On a spring morning in 1889, a 29-year-old doctor named Harold Metcalf was sitting in his parlor in the tiny town of Exeter, Rhode Island, when he heard his telegraph machine start clicking. He got up, walked over to the large metal machine, and watched it slowly print text onto a long, thin piece of paper. When it finished printing, Dr. Metcalf tore off the paper and read the telegram. It was a message from one of his neighbors, a farmer named George Brown. George said in this telegram that his only son, 22-year-old Edwin, had fallen ill, and he desperately needed Dr. Metcalf's help. The doctor let out a long sigh. He knew the Browns well. They'd once been a happy family of 9, with George, his wife, their 6 daughters, and their son, but Dr. Metcalf was all too aware of the tragedy that had struck the family over the past few years. 7 years ago, George's wife had come down with a mysterious disease that some locals called the White Death. It caused horrible symptoms like chronic fevers, extreme weight loss, and uncontrollable coughing. People with the disease grew pale and weak, and they got so emaciated that they looked like skeletons. It was like the disease literally drained the life out of them. Now, there were a lot of supposed treatments for the White Death, things like riding on horseback every day or drinking brown sugar mixed with water, but Dr. Metcalf knew these remedies did not work. In fact, he knew there was just no proven way to cure the White Death. Now, Dr. Metcalf had tried to help George's wife 7 years earlier by prescribing healthy food and exercise, but she still just kept on getting sicker. And in fact, she would die a year later, and then almost immediately afterwards, one of George's daughters also began showing symptoms of the dreaded disease. And again, Dr. Metcalf tried to help, but there was nothing he could do, and she also died within just a few months. Even though Dr. Metcalf knew the White Death was basically incurable, he still felt guilty for not being able to help George and his loved ones. And now, after reading George's telegram, Dr. Metcalf feared that Edwin might be the latest member of the Brown family to contract the deadly disease. But there was only one way to find out. Dr. Metcalf quickly packed his medical bag, threw a saddle on his horse, and raced off towards the Browns' farm. 15 minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trotted his horse along a thin country road in Exeter. To his right, he saw a vast field overgrown with weeds, with a crumbling country house right in the center. It was once a prosperous farm, but was now abandoned. The sight made Dr. Metcalf sad. He'd lived in Exeter his whole life, and he'd watched the quaint farming community turn into sort of a ghost town. The Civil War and the White Death had decimated the community, leaving only a third of the population alive. In fact, these days, the town was more commonly known by its nickname, Deserted Exeter. After riding for a few more minutes, Dr. Metcalf reached a modest house on 40 acres of farmland. He knocked on the door, and right away, George Brown answered. He looked haggard, and he quickly led Dr. Metcalf to Edwin's bedroom. Inside the room, the doctor saw Edwin's wife and 5 remaining sisters crowded around a big 4-poster bed. Edwin was lying on the mattress in plain sight, but Dr. Metcalf barely could recognize him. The once husky farmhand had become bony and pale. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were glassy, and when he tried to speak, he fell into a violent coughing fit. It was obvious to everyone, including the doctor, that Edwin had been gripped by the White Death. As Edwin tried to catch his breath, his father, George, approached the side of the bed and looked at the doctor and asked if there was anything he could do. Dr. Metcalf began rattling off his regular treatment plan, healthy food and exercise, but George stopped him. He said they'd already tried those things with his wife and his daughter, and they hadn't worked. There had to be something different they could try. Dr. Metcalf hesitated, but then he said, yeah, there was another option. But he told them it was an experimental treatment, and so he couldn't guarantee it would work. George said he didn't care. At this point, he was willing to try anything to help Edwin. So Dr. Metcalf explained that some physicians believed that the White Death was caused, or at least was made worse, by living in humid climates, like Rhode Island. So it might help if Edwin moved out of Rhode Island and went somewhere with completely different weather. The doctor suggested Colorado Springs, Colorado, because it was a mountain town with very dry air and high elevations, and so it would be a drastic change from Rhode Island. But there was one really obvious problem. To get to Colorado, Edwin would have to travel 2,000 miles, and this would mean days and days of riding trains and horses, all while Edwin was severely ill, like it wasn't clear if he would live through the journey. Plus, his whole family couldn't just go with him, it would basically be Edwin and maybe his wife. And so after explaining this experimental protocol, Dr. Metcalf went quiet and just watched the Browns as they considered what he had just said. and it was obvious the entire family was very upset and didn't know what to make of this, but at the same time, they knew they had no other choice. And so as the sisters kind of held back tears and whispered amongst each other, and as George looked up at the doctor not sure what to say, finally Edwin, from the bed, croaked out the first words he'd said that day. He said that yes, he and his wife would go to Colorado. Three years later, in January of 1892, Edwin held his wife's hand as they walked through the snow in the Rocky Mountains. The high elevation and dry air in Colorado Springs had worked like a charm. Edwin was back to feeling like his normal self again. After walking a bit longer, Edwin told his wife they should head back home for lunch. When they got to their house, Edwin's wife rushed inside out of the cold, but Edwin stayed for a second and checked the mailbox for any letters from his dad and sisters. And he found there was an envelope, so he opened it and he unfolded the note inside. It was a handwritten letter from his father, and as Edwin scanned the paper, his face fell. The note said that one of Edwin's little sisters, 19-year-old Mercy, had unfortunately passed away. Edwin knew that Mercy had been sick. She'd contracted the White Death almost a year earlier. He had tried to convince her to move out to Colorado with him and his wife because he knew that would cure this, but Mercy said she didn't think she could make the long journey, and she didn't want to leave behind her sisters, and so she had stayed. But now, Mercy was gone. And so Edwin knew he would need to head back to Rhode Island and be there to grieve with his family. A few weeks later, back in Rhode Island, Edwin and his father braced themselves against the harsh winter cold in Exeter, and together, they silently dug rocks out of the frozen ground. They were trying to prepare the field for planting in the spring. It was hard work, but the physical labor was actually a welcome distraction from their grief. Edwin pushed a sharp shovel into the ground, and as he wedged another rock out of the soil, he suddenly felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. He dropped his shovel and started coughing so hard that it stung his throat. He put a hand over his mouth to block the cough, and when he caught his breath and moved his hand away, he saw that his palm was now speckled with blood. When he looked up, Edwin saw his father staring at him with a horrified expression. They both knew what this meant. Now that he was back in Rhode Island, Edwin's case of the White Death had returned. In March, about a month later, George woke in the night to the sound of his only son coughing violently. George jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen to grab a cup of water, and then made his way into Edwin's room, which was dimly lit by an oil lamp. Edwin had become so sick after contracting the White Death that he couldn't go anywhere, and he had been bedridden for the last 2 weeks here in Rhode Island. It was like all the progress he'd made living in Colorado had now been undone, and he was now sicker than he'd been before. He looked frail and gray, and George could see spots on the white bedsheet from where Edwin had been coughing up blood. George held out the cup of water for his son, and Edwin grabbed the glass with shaky hands and drank it in between coughs. Then Edwin looked at his father, and in a hoarse and frightened voice, he said something that terrified George. He said, "She was here. She haunts me." George just stared at his son. He had no idea what his son was talking about, but before George could ask, Edwin was gripped by another coughing fit, and the only thing George could think to do was send for Dr. Metcalf. Less than an hour later, George stood by Edwin's bedside as Dr. Metcalf examined his son. Now, George knew his son was in very bad shape at this point, but he was still shocked when Dr. Metcalf, after examining Edwin, turned to George and just said, "It's in God's hands now." There was apparently nothing he or anyone else could do to help Edwin. George was beyond devastated. He had lost his wife, 2 daughters, and now he was just counting the days until his only son passed away too. He felt totally powerless. But Edwin, despite hearing this grave news, was putting on a brave face. With his voice still hoarse from coughing, he asked his father if he had any whiskey. If his days were indeed numbered, well, they might as well enjoy the last few moments. George nodded and headed to the kitchen, and as he was taking glasses out of the cabinet for the whiskey, he heard a knock at the door, which was odd because it was well past midnight and he never had visitors this late. George set the glasses down, made his way to the door, and opened it up to see 6 of his neighbors standing there on the porch. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, said they'd heard that his son Edwin was sick, and a few of them had seen Dr. Metcalf come over earlier, and so they were concerned. But they said they were not just here to pay their condolences, they were here to try to save him. George had to stop himself from letting out a very bitter laugh. He already knew no one could help his son. No one had been able to help anybody else in his family when they had the White Death, and it was just a matter of time before his son died. But he let the neighbors inside anyway, if only because seeing a few familiar faces might lift his son's spirits. When George and the visitors rounded the corner into Edwin's room, most of the neighbors went to Edwin's bedside to say hello, but the older woman walked directly towards Dr. Metcalf and began speaking to him in a very hushed voice. George was curious, so he walked closer to listen, and he heard this woman tell Dr. Metcalf that she actually knew how to cure Edwin. The doctor told her that was not possible, nobody could cure this sickness. But the woman said Edwin was not sick, he was actually cursed by a vampire. George watched Dr. Metcalf's face go red with anger. He told the woman that she was being absolutely ridiculous. The doctor then looked over at George like he wanted somebody to back him up here, but George was desperate enough to consider anything at this point, and as crazy as a vampire's curse sounded, he didn't think it was that far-fetched, and so he wanted to hear more from this woman. After all, the White Death had made his loved ones look like the life was being sucked out of them, almost like a vampire was draining their blood. And just earlier that night, Edwin had said something to George that totally caught him off guard when he said, "She was here, she haunts me." And so George wondered if maybe his son was referencing this vampire. And so George turned from the doctor to his son and asked him about what he had said earlier about somebody being in the room with him, somebody haunting him. And Edwin croaked out that earlier, when he was alone in the room, he had seen this woman standing in the corner of his bedroom, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. Now, he said he didn't know if this had been a dream or not, but it had felt so real that now he was scared to death from the experience. To George, his son's testimony only seemed to strengthen the neighbor's vampire theory. However, George told the older woman that he wanted proof that this really is what was going on, that a vampire was behind what was happening to his family. And so the older woman called over another one of the neighbors, a farmer that George sometimes shared crops with, and he told George and Dr. Metcalf that he'd seen cases like this before. He explained that sometimes when a person died, a dark supernatural force would take over their body and cause them to leech the life out of their surviving loved ones, even from beyond the grave. These people were not really dead, the farmer said, they were vampires. At this point, the older woman interrupted the farmer and said to figure out which one of George's deceased family members was the vampire, all they had to do was exhume the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters. If one of the women's bodies hadn't yet decomposed, or if her heart still contained blood, that was a telltale sign that she was the vampire. To George, this whole process sounded barbaric, and he couldn't bear the thought of seeing his wife and children's decomposing bodies. But for all he knew, his neighbors could be right, and this could be his only chance to save his only son. So George gave the neighbors his blessing to go dig up his family members' bodies, and then George turned to Dr. Metcalf and, said he couldn't go and see this, and so asked the doctor to please go to the graveyard on his behalf. That way the doctor could be his eyes and also be the voice of reason. A few minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trudged through the dirt, lagging behind the neighbors, as they made their way toward the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Between the 7 of them, they had 3 small lanterns, one of which Dr. Metcalf was holding to light his way. As the doctor walked along, he could hear the neighbors up ahead of him whispering about this vampire and what they were going to do, and it was hard for the doctor not to feel totally annoyed because he did not believe a curse was behind what was happening to George's family. But he reminded himself that George was utterly desperate and had really kind of convinced himself that maybe this curse really was the thing, and Dr. Metcalf didn't have the heart to just completely shoot it down. And so if this is what it took, going along with the neighbors to the graveyard to prove that George's son Edwin was not suffering from some kind of ridiculous curse, then ultimately this was worth it. Eventually, the neighbors and the doctor reached the cemetery's iron gates, which creaked as the farmer pushed them open. To the right of the entrance, Dr. Metcalf could see a stone crypt, and next to it, he could see the Brown family's plot. And it didn't take long for the group to locate the tombstones they were looking for. Dr. Metcalf stood a few feet away and watched while 2 of the neighbors held up lanterns and 3 others stuck shovels into George's wife's grave. They threw dirt to the side until eventually they unearthed her wooden coffin. The leader of the neighbors, the older woman who brought up the vampire curse, unlatched the casket, pulled it open, and revealed the dusty skeleton of George's late wife. She'd been dead for 9 years, and so her body had, like Dr. Metcalf had expected, totally decomposed. To the neighbors, though, this only meant that George's wife was not the vampire, but one of the 2 daughters was. So they reburied the wife and dug up George's first daughter, the one who had died just a few months after George's wife. And again, when they opened up the coffin, it was just full of bones, and so they reburied the daughter as well. And then finally, the neighbors exhumed Mercy, the second daughter, who had died just 8 weeks earlier. And what they found inside of her casket struck even Dr. Metcalf, the most skeptical person there, as absolutely inexplicable. Despite having been dead for 2 full months by this point, Mercy's body had not even begun to decompose. And to make things even stranger, Mercy's body was lying on its side, as if she had literally turned over in her grave after being buried. The gray-haired woman turned to Dr. Metcalf and pointed and said, "Look, there's your vampire." The doctor, who was admittedly kind of shaken up, still insisted there had to be some kind of rational medical explanation for this, but the neighbors wouldn't listen. They had already begun performing a ritual that they believed would kill the vampire, break the curse, and save Edwin's life. The neighbors gathered up twigs and arranged them on top of a nearby boulder. Then the farmer flicked a match and kindled the flame into a small bonfire. And then Dr. Metcalf watched in stunned silence as the older woman pulled something out of a bag that she'd carried into the cemetery. And in the flickering light, he saw a flash of silver, and he realized what the woman had pulled from her bag was a huge kitchen knife. And then Dr. Metcalf looked on in horror as the woman stuck that blade directly into Mercy's abdomen, slicing her stomach open, and then the woman reached up under Mercy's ribs and pulled out her liver and her heart. And then after opening them up, both organs were indeed still full of coagulated blood, as though Mercy's body had been using these organs recently. At this point, the old woman placed Mercy's organs on top of the fire and let them burn down to ash. But after that, the ritual was not done. The older woman pulled something else out of her bag. It was a jar full of water, and she unscrewed the cap. Then she scooped the ashes of the organs and put them into this water, then closed the jar and shook up the contents. The woman said the ritual was almost complete. All they needed to do now was have Edwin drink this entire concoction of water and his sister's burned organs. The neighbors turned and began marching out of the cemetery, and Dr. Metcalf, who was still just shocked by everything he had just seen, kind of chased after them, begging them to stop, but none of them even looked back. They were on a mission. A little while later that evening, Edwin was propped up in bed, feeling lifeless and miserable, surrounded by his father, Dr. Metcalf, and the group of neighbors. Edwin held the jar of black liquid in his hands, but he hadn't drunk any of it yet. Instead, he listened as Dr. Metcalf and the older woman argued. Dr. Metcalf said that if Edwin drank that, it would only make him sicker. But the older woman insisted it was the only medicine that would cure him. Edwin looked to his father for some advice about what to do, but George told Edwin it was up to him. Staring at the watery ashes of his own sister's heart and liver, Edwin almost began to gag. He couldn't decide what to do. If he drank this vile liquid, he could die. But if he didn't drink it, he would still very likely die. So he ultimately decided he had nothing to lose. He unscrewed the jar's cap, brought the black water to his lips, and began to drink. But despite drinking his sister's burned liver and heart, 2 months after this ritual, Edwin still died of the White Death. The ritual had not worked. And after losing his only son, George Brown's life continued to get worse. Over the next 6 years, 3 more of his daughters would die of the White Death, leaving him with only one child, his daughter Hattie. George lived another 2 decades. However, his one remaining child, Hattie, would outlive George by about another 40 years. She would die in 1954, but she lived long enough to actually see a cure developed for the White Death, because it would turn out the White Death was not some curse caused by a vampire. It was actually a very common and very deadly infectious disease called tuberculosis, and by 1954, a vaccine had been developed. But back in the late 1800s, tuberculosis was a global epidemic. It was highly infectious, often spreading amongst families or other tight-knit social groups, and it accounted for 25% of all deaths in the northeastern United States, where the Brown family lived. But despite how common it was, tuberculosis was very poorly understood. There were many different types, and the symptoms could vary widely, so it wasn't always accurately diagnosed. And even when it was, there was no effective medications, so treatment was mostly guesswork. Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Mercy and found that her body had not decomposed, they took that as proof that she possessed supernatural powers and was behind the curse. But just like Dr. Metcalf suspected on the night where they exhumed her, there actually was a rational explanation for why Mercy's body had not decomposed. Mercy died in the middle of the harsh New England winter when the ground was so frozen that it would have been impossible to actually dig a grave. So instead of being buried underground in the cemetery next to her mother and sister, she was still buried in the cemetery, but above ground in that stone crypt, where her body was naturally frozen and preserved. As for why her body appeared to have rolled over inside of her coffin, that was most likely because the neighbors had moved the casket as they opened it and sort of accidentally shifted her remains. However, Mercy's reputation as a vampire lived on, and her story made headlines all across the country, and in fact, in 1896, one article about Mercy the Vampire made it into the hands of an aspiring novelist named Bram Stoker. He would release Dracula 1 year later, and the book featured a young woman who was turned into a vampire and later had her body exhumed. The character's name was Lucy, a combination of Mercy and her middle name, which was Lena. On a Monday morning in March of 2005, a 67-year-old retired teacher named Jane Miller woke up at her home in Ohio. She yawned and stretched, feeling well-rested after a relaxing weekend. The previous day, she'd gone to church with her family, then out to breakfast at their favorite diner, and she'd spent the rest of the day picking up around her house at a very leisurely pace. But after Jane sat up in her bed and rubbed her eyes and then opened them again, she yelped in shock. There, floating directly over her, was a disembodied head. Jane frantically reached over to her nightstand and grabbed her glasses. She slid them up her nose and looked again, hoping to see something different, i.e., not a floating face. But nope, it was definitely a floating face hovering right near the ceiling. And this face, in addition to being very odd because it's floating around in a room, also just looked totally bizarre. The head was shaped almost like a football, and it had piercing eyes and these yellowed buck teeth. And the face stared down at Jane with a hint of malice in its expression. Jane was obviously terrified. She leapt out of bed and raced downstairs to get away from this ghost in her room. Adrenaline was coursing through Jane's body as she fought to catch her breath, and when she reached the kitchen, she whipped around, and luckily, the ghost face was now gone and had not followed her. With shaking hands, she grabbed the phone and called her older sister, Melissa. She knew that if anybody would believe this story, it would be her big sister. 10 minutes later, Melissa flew down the street towards her sister's house, risking a speeding ticket in this residential neighborhood to get to Jane's house faster. She pulled into Jane's driveway and threw the car into park, and then ran up the walkway to Jane's house. The moment Melissa stepped inside of Jane's house, immediately something felt off. She couldn't explain it, there was just a coldness in the air. She called out for Jane and found her sister in the kitchen, still in her PJs, sitting in front of an uneaten bowl of cereal. It had been sitting there so long that the Cheerios were bloated and soggy. Jane looked up at Melissa, but her eyes were distant and her face was pale and scared as she whispered that the faces were now above her and beside her and everywhere else she looked. Melissa glanced around, but all she saw was the empty kitchen and her sister sitting there with her soggy bowl of cereal. And so Melissa just asked Jane, like, "Hey, are you feeling okay?" And Jane nodded and said, "I'm not crazy, I'm telling you the truth." And suddenly Melissa just felt so bad for Jane, and she assured her that, you know what, everything's gonna be fine. She told Jane, "I don't think you're crazy," but inside, Melissa thought, oh my goodness, something mentally could be wrong with her. And that's when a realization dawned on Melissa, and she felt a chill run up her spine. Melissa had read about this kind of thing on Facebook, and she knew exactly who she needed to call. The next day, Melissa was back at Jane's house, anxiously anticipating the arrival of her guest. Just then, she heard a knock at the door, and Melissa raced over to greet Father Raymond Smith. He'd been the pastor at Melissa's church for almost 15 years, and Melissa hoped he'd be able to help Jane. Melissa thanked Father Smith for coming over on such short notice, and she explained how worried she was for Jane, and invited him to follow her upstairs to Jane's bedroom. Father Smith smiled and told Melissa that whatever was going on with her sister, they would get to the bottom of it. Melissa crept up the stairs to Jane's bedroom with the sound of Father Smith's footsteps right behind her. And right as Melissa reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner into Jane's bedroom, a wave of icy cold seemed to hit her. To Melissa, it immediately seemed like malicious presences were hovering all around her sister, and they didn't like it when Melissa was in the room. Jane was lying in her bed, the covers pulled up to her face. Melissa knew her sister had her eyes closed under there because pitch darkness made it harder to see all the menacing faces all around her. Melissa quietly told Jane that help had finally arrived, and Jane, when she heard this, threw back the covers to see who was there. She blinked and said hello to Father Smith, though she was clearly surprised to see him there. Melissa smiled to herself because this had been her intention, to make sure the creatures that were menacing Jane had no idea who was coming over here. Melissa turned to Father Smith and invited him to begin. Then Melissa stood to the side while Father Smith shook Jane's hand and asked her to explain to him what had been going on over the past couple of days. Jane was a little embarrassed as she began to describe what she was seeing and what she was feeling, but Father Smith didn't actually seem to be listening. Instead, he was studying Jane's hands very carefully, and he was watching her expression and all of her bodily movements, and Melissa even wondered, what was he doing? Finally, after Jane stopped explaining what was going on with her, Father Smith told Jane why he was there. He said her sister, Melissa, had called him yesterday, worried that Jane was suffering from demonic possession. Melissa nodded in the corner. From the moment Jane had described the hallucinations to her, Melissa suspected that a dark entity was possessing her sister, and so she'd called Father Smith in the hopes that he could identify the demons and maybe perform an exorcism to get rid of them. Father Smith was the most devout priest Melissa had ever met. If he couldn't banish the demons back to hell, it was doubtful anybody else could. Except when Father Smith spoke again, he looked at Melissa and told her that he actually wasn't sure there were any demons to banish here. He explained that as Jane was speaking, he'd been trying to see if she had full control of her body, and from what he could tell, Jane was fully in charge of her movements. He hadn't seen any of the involuntary twitches or tics that typically accompany demonic possession. Then the father looked back at Jane and asked her to follow the movement of his finger as he whirled it all around in front of her. Father Smith just shook his head as he watched Jane follow his finger flawlessly, and then Father Smith said that, in his opinion, Jane needed to see a doctor, not an exorcist. Melissa was sort of dumbfounded and asked Father Smith if he was absolutely sure, and Father Smith said that, yeah, the dead giveaway to him at least was that Jane knew her hallucinations were not real. But Father Smith promised that if doctors could not figure out what was wrong with Jane, well, the church would call a certified exorcist who was properly trained within the Catholic Church, and that exorcist could examine Jane's psychological state and determine whether she was genuinely possessed or not. Melissa decided this was a good compromise and agreed to take Jane to a hospital right away. Father Smith thanked her and then offered to pray over Jane before he left. Melissa said that would be nice and prayed silently as Father Smith recited a blessing with his hands outstretched. Three days later, Dr. Randall Crane stood in a hospital room with Jane, watching her sketch a little doodle on his notepad. Dr. Crane was an internal medicine resident at the hospital, and Jane was the most fascinating patient he'd had in a long time. She'd been suffering from these crazy hallucinations for the past few days and was scared that she was losing her mind. Now, Crane didn't know if that was actually true, that she was losing her mind, but he could not explain why she was hallucinating faces all the time, and so he couldn't rule out some form of dementia. And so Dr. Crane, kind of on a whim, had asked Jane to go ahead and sketch on his notepad what she was actually seeing, like draw the face. And so Jane finished sketching and handed the notebook back to Dr. Crane, and she warned him that she was no artist, but this is really what she was seeing floating over her head right now and all the time. Dr. Crane looked down at the doodle that Jane had drawn. The so-called demon face had an oblong, football-shaped head with big buck teeth and round, bulging eyes. It looked more like a Muppet than a monster. In all honesty, it actually reminded him of the main character in an old children's cartoon called Hey Arnold that the doctor had watched all the time when he was a kid. But even if the sketch was sort of funny, he took Jane's condition very seriously. He clearly understood why she'd be terrified to see something like this following her around all the time. And so Dr. Crane asked Jane a few questions, like whether these hallucinations had spoken to her, or if she was experiencing headaches, fever, or seizures around the time these hallucinations appeared, and she said no to all of them. And so Dr. Crane told Jane not to worry. He was going to order some routine blood work to see if maybe she had an infection, and he also ordered a toxicology screening just to rule out any bad drug interactions. An hour later, Jane sat on the examination table feeling very anxious. Dr. Crane told her that all her tests had come back normal, which actually initially made Jane more nervous. She wondered if now she and Melissa would have to call that certified exorcist after all. But Dr. Crane did not seem like he was totally confused. He actually said, "Jane, I want to look at your eyes more closely." And so Jane leaned forward and then followed Dr. Crane's instructions as he first tested her peripheral vision and then also her forward eyesight. And then afterwards, Dr. Crane informed Jane that she had a couple of small blind spots in her vision that he had just discovered that made him want to examine her retinas a bit more closely. Dr. Crane took a little vial of liquid out of his white coat pocket and then told Jane to look straight up. He was going to dilate her retinas, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of the eye that transmits what we see to the brain. The doctor would first pour a little of that liquid into her eyes, and then he would use a device called an ophthalmoscope to shine some light on her retinas and get a better look at what was going on. And so as the liquid made her eyes become more sensitive, the light from the ophthalmoscope stung a bit, but Jane did her best to stay still as Dr. Crane looked at her retinas. And then finally, Dr. Crane switched off the ophthalmoscope and he smiled. He would order a CT scan to confirm his theory, but he was pretty sure he knew exactly what was going on. And 2 hours later, the CT scan confirmed Dr. Crane's suspicion. He told Jane that he'd seen some tiny yellow tissue deposits behind her retinas. These are a sign that her retinas are deteriorating, a condition called macular degeneration. It happens to lots of people as they age. Their eyesight gets worse, and because of that, the brain gets less visual information from their eyes. Now, most people with macular degeneration end up with nothing more serious than slightly blurrier eyesight. But in about 10% of cases, the brain tries to compensate for the lack of information by making up new visuals. For reasons that are still not clear, many of these people who are in this 10% see floating faces. It's very rare, but the symptoms are so consistent amongst patients who suffer from it that Dr. Crane immediately understood what Jane's problem was the moment he saw her drawing that football-shaped head doodle. 3 months after her diagnosis, Jane was unfortunately still having hallucinations, but they were growing more infrequent. Dr. Crane told Jane that while there was no treatment, the hallucinations can stop over time as the brain becomes more accustomed to vision loss. And at the very least, Jane could rest assured knowing that she was not possessed by a demonic entity, and she wasn't losing her mind either. She just had a very creative brain. Here is our second story called The Perfect Condition. On May 19, 2010, 75-year-old Ron Sveden was at home in Brewster, Massachusetts, relaxing in his favorite armchair and flipping through TV channels in search of something good to watch. He'd finally settled on a game show when his wife Nancy called him for dinner. He sighed and turned off the TV, muttering about how he'd just gotten comfortable. He hobbled out of his chair and adjusted the plastic tube that he wore under his nose to help him breathe. The year before, Ron had been diagnosed with emphysema, a lung disease that causes shortness of breath. Emphysema is common in smokers, and Ron had been a smoker his whole life. Now, as a result, he needed an oxygen tank just to breathe properly. Ron sat down at the dining room table just as Nancy set a plate of scallops in front of him. Ron caught a whiff of melted butter, but his stomach didn't rumble with hunger the way it usually did when he smelled Nancy's amazing cooking. In fact, he didn't have an appetite at all, which was a shame because Nancy's scallops were his favorite meal. But Ron didn't want to be rude, so he thanked Nancy for dinner and tried to eat as best as he could, but he really just couldn't and just kind of pushed the food around his plate. And then when Nancy was done eating, Ron quickly got up and helped her clear the table and clean up before Ron settled back down to watch more TV. 2 weeks later, in early June, Ron was back in his favorite armchair in the living room, working on the daily crossword puzzle. He wasn't feeling his best, because he really had not eaten much since that scallop dinner a couple weeks ago. Now, Ron didn't think too much of it. He was getting older, and so he thought maybe he just didn't need as much food. Ron reread a clue on his crossword puzzle that had been stumping him all morning. He started to call out for Nancy, hoping she could help him, when a small tickle rose in his chest. He cleared his throat, and then all of a sudden he began coughing and hacking, and he couldn't stop. His chest felt stiff, like there was a wall of mucus that just was not breaking up. And so he leaned back in his armchair, coughing so hard it was getting hard to even breathe. He heard footsteps behind him, and a minute later, Nancy was by his side with a glass of water. Ron tried to sip some down, but another cough hit him and he spit the water everywhere. By the time this coughing fit passed, Ron's throat was so sore. He'd never experienced a cough like that, and it really scared him. He worried his emphysema was getting worse. Later that night, Ron was in his bedroom putting on pajamas when his back suddenly went stiff, almost like a spasm. He straightened up and kind of yelped in pain, and then threw his head back as another coughing fit overtook him. He hacked and coughed until he was shaking, and then Nancy came into the bedroom and rubbed his back until finally Ron began to recover. Once he had, Nancy asked him if he wanted to call the doctor, but he told her no. Clearly, his emphysema was just getting worse and he would just have to deal with it. After decades and decades of smoking cigarettes, he knew his lungs just were not what they used to be. A few days later, Nancy was moving all through the house, vacuuming and cleaning up, trying to prep the house for Ron's sister and brother-in-law who were coming over to visit. The couple had just gotten back from Scotland on a vacation, and they were coming over to talk about the trip and catch up. Secretly, Nancy hoped they'd brought home some Scottish shortbread to share. Just before 5 p.m., the doorbell rang, and so Nancy called out to Ron, who was asleep in his armchair when she last saw him. Then Nancy threw open the front door and embraced her in-laws. She was always happy to see them, but especially right now. She wanted to be around family. Over the past few days, Ron's coughing fits had become so severe and so frequent, it was kind of scary. It was common for Ron to be doubled over and hacking up a lung 15 or 16 times a day. And so Nancy was genuinely worried about Ron's health, and so just liked the idea of having some family around, maybe take her mind off of that for a second. Nancy's brother-in-law handed her a brown bag that smelled like butter and seafood. Nancy opened it as she led the way inside, and the bag was full of her favorite lobster rolls. Not from Scotland, but just from down the street. However, still, it was a welcome treat. Nancy led everyone into the living room, where Ron was still fast asleep. Nancy shook his leg and told him his sister was here, but Ron didn't move. Nancy frowned, but she could see Ron's chest was rising and falling, so he seemed okay. And so she told her in-laws it might be best not to wake him. His coughing fits had been really bad lately and clearly had been tiring him out. Nancy moved into the kitchen to grab plates for the lobster rolls. She could hear her in-laws taking seats in the dining room. And just then, Nancy heard a familiar, horrible cough erupt in the living room. Nancy felt terrible for Ron as she listened to him hacking. She knew it was also very painful for him. His throat had been raspy and hoarse for the last 2 weeks because of these coughing fits. Then, Ron started gasping between his horrible coughs, like he couldn't even breathe. And then Nancy heard him groaning a little as though he was calling out for help. And so Nancy rushed into the living room. Ron was rocking in his chair, fighting for air between these violent coughs. His entire body was shaking, and Nancy thought he might be having a seizure. Panicked, she dialed 911. For the next few minutes, Nancy and her in-laws tried to soothe Ron until the EMTs finally arrived. By the time they had Ron on a stretcher and were rolling him into the ambulance, one of the EMTs told Nancy that she'd been right to call. Ron's blood pressure and oxygen saturation levels were dangerously low. If she hadn't called, Ron would likely be facing organ failure. And so as the EMT helped Nancy up into the ambulance, she felt terrified. Now Nancy was the one who was shaking as the ambulance door closed and they whisked their way towards Cape Cod Hospital. The next morning, the pulmonary and critical care specialist at Cape Cod Hospital, Dr. Scott Slater, made his way to Ron's hospital room. When Ron was brought into the emergency room the previous night, he had been quickly diagnosed with pneumonia, a lung infection that creates a buildup of fluid in the air sacs. For someone of Ron's age, pneumonia can be a very dangerous and even deadly condition. Now, the ER doctor had immediately given Ron antibiotics to help him fight off the infection, but so far Ron was not getting better. So, just an hour ago, Dr. Slater had ordered a chest x-ray, and now, because of that x-ray, he had a better idea of what was going on inside of Ron's lungs. Dr. Slater knocked on the doorway and walked into Ron's room. Ron was lying in bed, hooked up to an IV and an oxygen tank. Ron looked pale and tired, and his breathing was labored. Nancy was sitting in a chair beside him, and she looked up from the newspaper she'd been reading and gave Dr. Slater a weak smile. Dr. Slater gave her a sad look and then delivered the bad news. Ron's x-ray had revealed that he had a collapsed lung, which was likely causing his pneumonia. Dr. Slater guessed that the lung had collapsed because something was blocking an airway. He needed to get a closer look by performing a bronchoscopy, which meant sliding a little camera down Ron's throat and into his lungs. After giving Ron an injection of local anesthesia, which would mean Ron was awake but unable to feel pain, Dr. Slater slid the camera down Ron's esophagus. And immediately, the problem became clear. There was an abnormal-looking mass at the top of Ron's left bronchial tube. Dr. Slater couldn't tell what this mass was, so he took a little tissue sample of this mass to send to the labs for analysis. After he'd pulled the camera out of Ron's throat, Dr. Slater explained to Ron and to Nancy that he had found this mass inside of Ron's lungs. Now, it would be a few days before they'd know for sure what it was, but the doctor felt they should know right now that that mass could be cancer. As Dr. Slater left the hospital room, Ron felt terrified. But Nancy, she shook her head and told Ron there was no point in panicking until they knew the biopsy results. And then she kissed Ron on the forehead and told him she was going to step into the hallway and call their kids and his sister and let them know what was going on. Ron watched his wife leave, feeling his chest tighten, but not because another coughing fit was coming on. He was thinking about how much time he'd have left if the biopsy came back positive for lung cancer. It could be a matter of months, or maybe even less. The thought of leaving his family now brought on this horrible wave of fear. He could feel tears welling up in his eyes as he looked out into the hallway and watched Nancy pace as she called their loved ones to break the terrible news. 4 days later, Ron was still in the hospital, sitting up in bed, tray of hospital food in front of him. He still wasn't hungry, so he just drank the juice out of the little plastic fruit cup they'd given him. Meanwhile, Nancy, who had barely left his bedside, was doing her best to try to coax her husband into taking a few bites.
Dark days behind us, leaving them in the dust. No more shadows chase us, we rise, we must. Broken hearts mending, pain is finally ending. Hope is now transcending, new lights blending. Bright future shining through the tears we cry. Together defining a love we can't hide. Through storms we travel, chains of fate unravel. Now the path is level, dreams no longer shell. Future's ours for taking, every dawn we're making. No more hearts breaking, together we're waking. Bright future shining through the tears we cry. Together defining a love we can't hide. Future's ours for taking, every dawn.
But just then, Ron heard a knock and looked up to see Dr. Slater standing in the doorway. Instinctively, Ron knew Dr. Slater had the biopsy results, and so Ron braced himself for the worst. But then, a smile crept across Dr. Slater's face. He told Ron and Nancy that there were absolutely signs of infection in the tissue, but no cancer cells. Ron was so relieved he almost started crying. He rubbed his eyes and felt Nancy's hand squeezing his shoulder. Ron breathed in as deeply as he could, trying to steady himself. He didn't have cancer, but there was still a mass in his lung, and Ron thought that couldn't be normal. And so he asked Dr. Slater, since this mass was not a cancerous tumor, well, what is it? Dr. Slater admitted to Ron that he didn't know, but he hoped that a second biopsy would help him find out. 10 days later, Dr. Slater sat in the office of a colleague, Dr. Jeff Spillane. Dr. Spillane was a thoracic surgeon who specialized in the organs and tissue inside the chest. Dr. Slater had always considered him a good friend, and now Dr. Slater hoped that Dr. Spillane could be a good consultant, too. Dr. Slater was feeling frustrated with Ron's case and really needed a second opinion. Dr. Slater explained to Dr. Spillane that Ron's pneumonia had persisted and his cough had gotten worse over the past week and a half. It was almost like Ron's body was trying to cough up the mass on its own. But after 2 biopsies, Dr. Slater still didn't have any idea what this mass was. It looked like a tumor, but it was not cancerous, so it wasn't clear why it was making Ron so sick. Dr. Slater bounced his knees impatiently as Dr. Spillane read through Ron's file. Finally, Dr. Spillane suggested that they do a 3rd bronchoscopy, but this time they would put Ron under general anesthesia. If Ron was totally unconscious, they could do a more in-depth examination of Ron's chest. Dr. Slater was skeptical, but at this point, he was willing to try anything. So he agreed to let Dr. Spillane perform this procedure. Around 2 p.m. that afternoon, Dr. Slater was sitting in his office when he got a call from his friend Dr. Spillane. He just finished Ron's bronchoscopy, and now he said he had only one question for Dr. Slater. Did he have any dirt? For a moment, Dr. Slater was sure he'd misheard Dr. Spillane, until Dr. Spillane repeated himself and said that Dr. Slater was going to need some dirt for the thing he just found inside of Ron's lung. A sprouting pea plant, as in a living vegetable. Dr. Slater couldn't believe it. Ron must have eaten a raw pea that quite literally went down the wrong tube. Instead of landing in his stomach, it got into his lung. And there, the moist and warm conditions inside the lung were just right for the little pea to sprout. According to Dr. Spillane, the pea sprout was about ½ an inch long. It had clearly been in Ron's lung for a while because it was so coated in mucus that it looked like a little tumor. Dr. Spillane had easily removed the pea and surrounding mass, and Ron immediately began feeling better. Within a few days, he was coughing far less frequently, and his pneumonia disappeared. Ron still had emphysema, but it was far more manageable without the hacking cough. His appetite returned as well. In fact, his first meal when he left the hospital included a side of peas. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Land. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon.